In the face of Chow, when the odds are stacked against them, heroes rise. Welcome to Twist Effect Stories, where every heartbeat, every bullet, and every impossible decision could be the difference between life and death. We bring you the real stories of courage, survival, and fate-defying moments that will leave you questioning what's truly possible. Subscribe now and prepare for the twist. The wind scraped across the barren plateau like an invisible blade, carrying with it the smell of dust and distant gunpowder. Staff Sergeant Sophia Kane lay prone behind a jagged ridge of limestone, her body pressed so low to the earth it seemed she might dissolve into it. Beneath the hood of her mottled ghillie suit, strands of deep chestnut hair were braided tight against her head, hidden from the relentless Afghan sun. Her eyes, sharp slate gray and unsettlingly calm, stared through the shimmering heat waves in her scope. 2,240 meters away, beyond valleys scarred by years of war, sat a fortress that seemed carved from the mountain itself. Thick walls of sun-baked stone guard towers with sentries moving in mechanical rotations, and an upper level with narrow blackened windows that concealed more than they revealed. Sophia did not blink as she had been watching for hours, her breathing measured and her heart steady. To the men of Commander Robert Steele's SEAL team, crouched nearby, she looked like just another Army sniper assigned to Overwatch. They saw the same weathered gear, the same rifle resting on its bipod, the same deliberate patience of a professional marksman. What they did not see, what almost no one knew, was that Sophia Kane was not just a good shot, she was the shot. A ghost in the records, a whisper in after-action reports that did not officially exist. Her call sign was Shadow. 4 or 5 years her name had been locked behind clearance levels, so high most generals could not access her file. She had erased high-value targets across 3 continents, never detected, never missed. In military backchannels, Marine scouts spoke of her in low voices, Army Rangers traded rumors about her impossible distances, and even the most hardened Delta operators paused when her codename surfaced. But the men around her now knew none of this. This morning's mission on paper was simple: observe and report. Intelligence had flagged the fortress as the site of a meeting between high-ranking enemy leaders. No engagement orders, no trigger pulls. They were here to watch, document, and leave. The compound, however, sat farther than any standard rifle could reliably reach, over a mile and a quarter from the closest cover, too far for interference, just close enough for eyes on surveillance. Commander Steele had not liked the idea from the beginning. A 16-year veteran with a chest full of ribbons and a reputation for keeping his team tight, he did not see why an Army sniper, his words said with a deliberate pause, needed to be in his operation. SEALs had their own shooters, and they were damn good at what they did. Outside attachments meant variables, variables meant risk. But the order had come directly from Admiral Michael Tannen, and it was explicit: Kane is your primary long-range observation specialist. No explanation, no justification, just a command signed in digital ink. Steele had read her visible file. It was bland, too bland. Routine deployments, standard qualifications. It looked like the file of someone who had never left a training range. That alone made him suspicious, because men like Tannen did not pull strings for rookies. At precisely 0942, Sophia's voice cut through the quiet on the secure channel, calm and almost clinical. 3 primary structures in the compound: main building, northwest side, heavy guard presence, perimeter patrol pattern repeats every 12 minutes, approximately 22 armed hostiles visible. Her tone carried no ego in it, only the detached precision of someone mapping an equation. She did not need to glance at notes, the layout was already printed in her mind. She adjusted her focus ring, tracking movement along the upper windows. Thermals show multiple heat signatures on the top floor. Estimate 12 to 15 individuals. Meeting is in progress. Steele slid up beside her, one knee in the dirt, peering through his own binoculars. The fortress shimmered under the heat haze. He could not see half of what she was describing, but he was not about to admit that. Any confirmation on high-value personnel, he asked. Not yet, she murmured, but the patterns fit whoever is inside. They are important. The team had been in position for over 3 hours, each operator falling into their silent rhythm, one scanning for movement in the surrounding hills, one logging intercepted communications, another monitoring drone feeds far overhead. Sophia did not move except to adjust her aim by a fraction of a degree every few minutes. The stillness was not just discipline, it was her natural state when the rifle was in her hands. She had not been raised like other soldiers. Back in Boston, her father had been an aerospace ballistics engineer, her mother a professor of applied physics. Dinner conversations had revolved around wind resistance, angular momentum, and the mathematics of moving bodies. By the time most children were learning multiplication, she was calculating projectile arcs on napkins and experimenting with homemade slingshots in the backyard. She learned to measure wind speed by the way leaves turned in the air and to sense distance by how sound changed across it. Now those early lessons lived in her breathing, in the slow rhythm of her pulse, and in the steel stillness of her body as she kept the fortress framed in her scope. Somewhere behind those thick stone walls the meeting was happening. She knew without needing to be told that whatever decisions were being made inside would ripple across battlefields far beyond this sun-baked valley. The ridge under her elbows vibrated faintly from the low growl of an approaching convoy somewhere to the east. Her slate-gray eyes never left the scope, but in her mind the picture of the battlefield shifted, a new layer of urgency beginning to form. And it was then that movement inside the top-floor windows caught her attention. The faint shimmer of heat made the upper windows ripple in Sophia's scope, but her eyes locked in on three figures moving in deliberate patterns. They were not guards, and they were not the restless pacing of nervous men. They stood with authority and pointed to large maps laid out across a heavy wooden table. Her breath slowed as she marked their silhouettes in her mind, the cut of their uniforms, the way others in the room deferred to them. These were not ordinary officers. These were the type of targets whose absence could alter the course of a war. Commander Robert Steele crouched beside her against the rock, under his boots shifting slightly as he tried to follow her line of sight through his binoculars. He saw shapes, but not details. He knew the distance was pushing the limits of their equipment. Sophia spoke quietly, her voice carrying the same calm that had unnerved him since the first hour on the ridge. 3 high-value personnel, upper, northwest, windows, top floor range, 2,247 meters. Steele lowered his binoculars. The words high value meant everything and nothing, depending on what command wanted. If these were who he suspected, then every second mattered. Yet the range was impossible by conventional standards. Even their best SEAL sniper would hesitate before attempting one shot that far, let alone multiple consecutive shots. He weighed the reality in his mind: wind, humidity, temperature, elevation. Every factor screamed against the possibility. Sophia did not wait for him to speak. She could almost hear the math unfolding in his head like a skeptical equation. She had met his kind before, men carved from precision and disciplined men who trusted only what they had personally tested in the field. Her rifle rested steady against the bipod, the scope adjusted so finely she could see the pulse in a man's neck if he stood still long enough. Her mind had already started calculating wind drift at multiple altitudes, factoring the rotation of the earth, the density of the air, and the slight angular offset from her position to the targets. For her, these numbers were not a blur of complications. They were a rhythm she could ride to a perfect shot. Steele finally leaned back, his expression carved in lines of resistance and responsibility. Even if you could hit one, the others would scatter, he said in a voice low enough to barely carry. And moving closer is out of the question. We would be inside their detection range before we could even set up. Sophia kept her eyes on the glass in front of her, the fortress still framed perfectly. I can take them all 3, she replied with the certainty of someone stating a fact, not making a boast. He studied her profile, the hard line of her jaw, the way her gloved hands rested without tension on the rifle. In his 16 years leading special operations, he had worked with expert shooters from every branch, some of the finest marksmen in the world. Not one of them would make that claim in these conditions. Her statement was either arrogance beyond comprehension or a truth he had never encountered before. The air between them tightened as the silence stretched. She could almost feel him measuring her against the impossible. Her memory drifted for a moment to the range test back in Virginia, where crosswinds tore lesser shooters apart, and where she had outshot the best in conditions that made instructors shake their heads. She had not been trained to think about what could not be done, only about the variables that needed to be solved. Finally, Steele exhaled slowly, his skepticism still anchored deep. That distance is beyond the effective range of our gear and beyond the probability curve for a human-sized target. You're talking about making 3 kills before anyone moves to cover without a single adjustment shot. Her voice stayed level, the words carrying like the steady tick of a metronome. The probability curve changes when you account for factors most people ignore. Wind layering at different altitudes, thermal lift from the valley, the micro changes in barometric pressure along the bullet's path. All of it can be mapped and compensated for. One of the younger SEALs shifted from his post nearby, glancing at them without speaking. The look in his eyes said he had heard every word and was already half convinced, though he would never admit it aloud in front of Steele. The sound of distant rotor blades began to hum in the background, a reminder that air patrols were active somewhere beyond the horizon. Every minute spent debating was a minute closer to losing the window entirely. Sophia reached slowly into her pack and pulled out a weatherproof notebook thick with folded pages. Inside were tightly written columns of numbers, diagrams of bullet trajectories, and adjustments for wind and heat that looked more like advanced engineering schematics than sniper notes. She set it in the dirt between them and flipped to a page marked with a red line. This was a shot at 2,100 meters taken in the mountains last winter, similar altitude, similar wind cross pattern. 2 corrections for wind shear at different elevations, 1 micro-angle adjustment for the Earth's rotation. The bullet landed within half an inch of the target center. Steele scanned the page, his eyes catching on the dense calculations and hand-drawn range diagrams. It was the kind of record you did not fake. If she had this for every shot, then she had been working on a level most operators never touched. He looked back through his binoculars at the 3 figures still clustered at the table. Their conversation animated their attention elsewhere. Even from here, their presence radiated command. If she was right, and these men were the enemy leadership, the impact of removing them would ripple across the region instantly. Sophia's voice cut the silence again, a thin steel edge beneath the calm. The window will not stay open forever, Commander. The ridge seemed to hold its breath as he considered the risk. In that moment, Steele was a man standing between the safety of protocol and the razor edge of opportunity. The choice he made would either be remembered as reckless or as the single decision that changed the war's direction. Commander Steele's jaw tightened as the weight of the moment settled on him, the sun pressing heat into his shoulders, the wind whispering through the jagged rocks around their position. The 3 figures in the window still leaned over their table, oblivious to the eyes fixed on them from over a mile away. Every second they remained in sight was a coin flipping in the air, and Steele knew that coin could land in his favor or cut his team's throat. Sophia kept her gaze locked through the scope, her breathing, even her heartbeat, slow enough to feel like part of the earth beneath her. To her, the scene was not chaos or urgency. It was a formula waiting to be completed. She could already see the path of each bullet in her mind, the arcs bending through the air, the corrections layered one upon another like the steps of a long equation. The wind at ground level brushed at 12 miles per hour from the northwest, but higher up it shifted in a subtle southeast curl, and she could feel it even without instruments. Air density was slightly thinner than standard due to their elevation, and she knew exactly how that would affect velocity and drop. Her fingers traced the small weatherproof notebook still open beside her. Each page bore the marks of years of field experience, not just in firing, but in translating the environment into numbers. Temperature gradients at different heights, wind shear maps, micro-pressure fluctuations from weather fronts miles away. In training, they had taught her the basics. In life, she had built a science. Steele leaned over the notebook, again his eyes running across the entries for shots taken in deserts, snowfields, and high mountain passes. It was like reading a foreign language. He could understand just enough to grasp its complexity and to know he could never replicate it himself. The others on the team had shifted their focus, one watching the valley floor for any sign of movement, another scanning the far ridge lines. The silence between them was heavy with the unspoken truth that something rare was unfolding here. Sophia adjusted the elevation turret on her scope with minute precision. At this distance, the bullet drop would be more than 400 inches. She calculated the holdover to the exact millimeter, compensating for the slight rise in the ground between her and the target. She then shifted the windage dial to account for the combined drift from ground and altitude layers. Finally, she considered the Coriolis effect, the imperceptible pull from the Earth's rotation that would nudge her around just enough to miss if ignored. Steele's mind wrestled with the decision in front of him. 16 years in the field had taught him to respect limits, and this was a mission with orders to observe only. But the orders from Admiral Tannen had not been normal either, and they had placed Sophia here for a reason. Removing those 3 men could fracture enemy command beyond repair. Failing to act could mean months more of ambushes, bombings, and dead civilians. Sophia spoke again, her voice low, steady, but carrying an undercurrent of absolute confidence. All environmental variables are favorable: wind, stable humidity, 31% temperature, 82 degrees, atmospheric pressure, 29.91 inches. Optimal engagement window, no more than 90 seconds before possible movement or visual obstruction. Steele raised his binoculars one last time. The generals were still there, their uniforms marked with insignia, and their hands moving over the maps as if carving the next phase of the war into reality. His gut tightened, because in that moment the choice became less about risk and more about whether he could walk away knowing he had let them live. The world seemed to narrow to the space between his decision and her trigger. He glanced down at the notebook again, at the careful loops of handwriting, the diagrams, the precision. It was madness by the numbers, but there was a calm in her posture that told him she had already run this scenario 100 times in her head. The SEAL team was watching now, without pretending otherwise. Even the youngest among them understood the gravity of this decision. In the tight circle of trust that formed between operators on the field, Steele felt something unfamiliar. It was not just belief in her skill, it was the faint pull of inevitability. Sophia's left hand steadied the rifle stock, her right adjusting the focus one last time. Her breathing slowed, further, her chest rising and falling like the tide. Every muscle was loose, but anchored, every nerve quiet but ready. The ridge, the valley, the fortress, all folded into a single frame. Steele's lips parted, and the words left him like a release of pressure built over hours. "Take the shots." Sophia gave the smallest nod, the kind that said the moment had been accepted, not just heard. Her focus tunneled entirely into the glass ahead of her, the 3 figures still unaware of the storm about to reach them. For her, there was no more time, no more conversation, only the rhythm of the countdown in her head and the invisible mathematics carrying her toward it. The air felt heavy, as if the valley itself knew something irreversible was about to happen. Sophia pressed her cheek to the rifle stock, her gray eyes fixed through the scope where the 3 enemy commanders stood bathed in the faint gold of mid-morning light. Her breathing was so slow, it seemed the world had to wait between each rise and fall of her chest. She began with the first target, standing nearest the leftmost window, his posture easy, his attention fixed on the table in front of him. Her mind ran the final sequence: wind at ground, level 12 from the northwest, wind aloft shifting at 7 from the southeast, temperature 82, humidity 31, pressure 29.91, elevation change 100 feet. The calculations slid into place without conscious effort, like beads falling into the groove of a track they had always belonged to. Her finger rested against the trigger pad, not tense, not hesitant, but patient. The Barrett's weight anchored into the earth, the bipod legs biting into the stone beneath them. Her lungs emptied halfway and held the pause between heartbeats stretched into eternity. She felt the precise moment when the body becomes still enough that the bullet will leave without disturbance. The rifle thundered. The concussion rolled through the ridge and echoed off the far cliffs, a shockwave of sound and power. The 50 caliber round tore into the open air, leaving it nearly 3,000 feet per second, carving a path across the shimmering distance. It dropped more than 400 inches in flight, drifted 19 to the right from calculated wind and earth rotation, and still arrived with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The first commander collapsed without sound visible from this range, his body sliding out of view behind the table edge. Sophia was already shifting her sight picture before the echo faded. The second commander's head turned sharply toward the sudden movement, giving her a perfect angle. No wasted thought, no adjustment shots, no hesitation. The second round roared from the barrel, the recoil absorbed into her shoulder without breaking her position. Through the glass, she saw the impact, a clean strike that ended his motion instantly. The third commander had begun to move, his instincts dragging him toward the nearest cover. This was the most complex shot, a moving target at over 2,200 meters, requiring predictive hold for both horizontal and vertical movement, plus the bullet's flight time. Her lead calculation factored his speed, direction, and the angle at which he would cross the narrow view between window frames. She shifted the reticle precisely ahead of him, exhaled again into that perfect stillness, and squeezed. The third shot left the muzzle like a silent pact between her and the physics she trusted. In the space of 2.4 seconds, it bridged the distance, found the small, vulnerable gap before he reached the wall, and ended his motion forever. All three targets were down. 12.3 seconds had passed. The world came rushing back into sound. The ringing echo of the Barrett's report faded into the wail of startled shouts from inside the fortress. Steele lowered his binoculars, his eyes wide, the disbelief plain even in a man who had seen everything. The nearest SEAL muttered something under his breath, barely audible, but laced with awe. Sophia's hands moved automatically, breaking down her position, her rifle returning to its case, every motion efficient and rehearsed. Her voice over the comms was calm, steady, confirmed elimination of all three high-value targets, recommend immediate withdrawal to extraction point Alpha. Steele still watched her for a moment longer before snapping back into command mode, issuing movement orders to the team. The ridge was abandoned within moments, boots finding their way down narrow rock paths that snaked away from the line of sight of the fortress. Behind them, the compound erupted into chaos, security forces flooding the courtyard, searching for a shooter who was already gone. As they moved quickly across uneven ground, the weight of what had happened settled over them. No one spoke of the distance or the impossibility of the shots, but every man in that team carried the image of what they had just witnessed. Steele stayed close to Sophia during the movement, his eyes still running the math in his head, as if replaying the impossible to find the flaw he knew was not there. The descent through the ravines was fast and silent, boots striking rock and gravel in a rhythm that kept pace with the ticking clock in every operator's mind. Sophia moved like she had done this countless times before, never glancing back toward the fortress, never breaking the flow of her stride. The Barrett case was slung across her back, balanced perfectly so it made no sound against her body. Above them, the sun burned in a pale blue sky, casting long shadows that stretched ahead as if guiding them toward the extraction point. Commander Steele signaled a brief halt in a patch of scrub that masked them from view while the forward element scouted the next pass. Sophia crouched on one knee, scanning the surrounding ridges with calm detachment. Steele watched her from a few paces away, his thoughts still tangled in the memory of the three shots. He had witnessed extraordinary marksmanship in his career, but nothing that belonged in the same category as what she had done on that ridge. It was more than skill, more than luck. It was as if she had reached into the laws of physics and bent them just enough to suit her purpose. When the path cleared, they moved again, weaving through gullies until the distant outline of a waiting transport vehicle came into view. The driver sat low in the seat, engine running, eyes scanning the horizon. One by one, the team loaded in the air inside the cabin, thick with sweat, dust, and unspoken questions. Steele sat across from Sophia, the hum of the engine filling the silence between them. He leaned forward, his voice low enough to be carried only to her. "Who are you really, Kane?" Her eyes met his without hesitation, the slate gray unflinching. "Officially, I am Staff Sergeant Sophia, Kane Army Sniper Reconnaissance Support. Unofficially, I am the reason certain people on the other side do not sleep well at night." Steele studied her face, searching for something that might give him more, but all he found was a quiet certainty. "What is your actual classification level?" "Above your clearance, Commander, with respect." For a long moment, he simply nodded, the smallest trace of a smile at the edge of his mouth. "Fair enough," he said, then, after a pause, added, "What you did today was the most incredible shooting I have ever seen." She inclined her head slightly, the acknowledgement accepted without pride or dismissal. "One more question," Steele said. "What is your longest confirmed kill?" Sophia's gaze drifted to the blur of the desert beyond the vehicle's open side. "That information is classified, but today was not my personal record." 3 months later, the official intelligence reports spoke of a collapse in enemy coordination across the entire region. Without their senior leadership, cells fractured into small, disorganized groups, unable to mount large-scale attacks. Coalition patrols moved freely through areas that had once been death traps, supply convoys reached their destinations without ambush, and civilian markets reopened in towns that had been silent for years. No medals were awarded to Sophia, no ceremony, no public acknowledgement. Her personnel file remained unremarkable to anyone without the clearance to see past its false layers. In the sealed archives of Special Operations Command, however, the record of those 3 shots sat marked with a notation of strategic significance unmatched in modern conflict. Steele was promoted to lieutenant commander and assigned to develop advanced sniper training for future SEAL teams. In his lectures, he never mentioned her name, but he built entire modules around the principles he had seen that day, pushing his students to think beyond the theoretical limits of their rifles. Sophia continued her work, moving from one classified operation to the next, taking shots that officially never happened, eliminating targets whose removal shifted the balance of wars before they could escalate. Her call sign Shadow passed quietly among those with the clearance to know it, a name carried not with the roar of legend, but with the quiet weight of inevitability. Years later, when military historians examined the turning points of the long conflict, they traced the decisive shift to the sudden absence of 3 enemy leaders on a single morning in the mountains. No official record would ever show that a rifle had fired on that day. It had been marked as a reconnaissance mission with no engagement recorded. Yet among the few who knew the truth, the memory remained clear. The SEAL commander had said, "No one could make that shot." Sophia Kane had proved that some people are not no one, and that when the impossible is placed in their hands, it becomes the inevitable.